Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I'm your host, educator Divya Saini, PGT History, and I am honestly so excited to dive into this with you all. Today, we're unpacking a very specific, incredibly fascinating segment of your NCERT History Chapter 1. We're looking at the rise of nationalism in Europe, but zooming in on what historians like to call the strange case of Britain. You know, we usually think of nations being born out of sudden fiery revolutions, right? But as you'll see today, history is almost never a one-size-fits-all subject. So grab your notebooks because we're going to break down this complex historical puzzle step by step to make sure you are absolutely rock solid for your exams. Here's our roadmap for the Explainer. We'll quickly touch on the norm of European nationalism, then dive right into the strange case of Britain. How the English Parliament seized power, the subjugation of Scotland, the incorporation of Ireland, and finally, how they forged a brand new British identity. Let's get started. Section 1. The norm of European nationalism. Okay, so to really grasp why the formation of Great Britain is considered this weird exception by scholars, we first need to look at what was considered normal in 19th century Europe. Think about Frédéric Souriau's incredibly famous 1848 print. You've probably seen it, the one showing democratic and social republics. In the foreground, you literally see the shattered, broken remains of absolute monarchies on the ground. Over in mainland Europe, like in France and the German states, becoming a nation-state meant sudden, explosive, and, quite frankly, bloody uprisings. Everyday people were actively revolting in the streets, tearing down empires to demand constitutional rights. That was the dramatic, revolutionary norm of the era. So that brings us to the big historical mystery of our lesson. If everyone else in Europe was forging their nations through the fires of sudden revolutions and democratic uprisings, how on earth did Britain become this unified, powerful nation-state without one massive, explosive revolution? What did they do differently? Well, let's figure it out. Section 2. The strange case of Britain. The primary thesis you absolutely need to remember for your exams is that the formation of the British nation-state did not happen overnight. On one side, you have the sudden upheaval we just talked about across mainland Europe, but on the other side, we have Britain's path, which the NCERT text explicitly defines as a long drawn-out process. Seriously, underline that phrase. There was no Bastille being stormed to create Britain in a single afternoon. Instead, it was this super slow, highly methodical, and deeply systematic power grab that took centuries. Keep that contrast in your head as we actually trace the steps of this long drawn-out process. Section 3. English Parliament seizes power. To understand how they pulled this off, we have to look at the engine behind it all. The force driving the creation of the British state wasn't a mob in the streets. It was an institution, the English Parliament. Now, chronological retention is key for your exams, so let's lock this timeline in. The whole story truly kicks off in 1688. That's when the English Parliament officially snatched power away from the monarchy. With England firmly in the driver's seat, they started expanding. We see the Act of Union with Scotland in 1707, Wolfe Tone's failed Irish Revolt in 1798, and Ireland finally getting officially absorbed in 1801. We're going to unpack each of these. But first, what did this map actually look like before all this expansion started? Here's a crazy thought. Prior to the 18th century, there was literally no such thing as a British nation. None. The primary identities of the people living on these islands were entirely ethnic. You were English, Welsh, Scottish, or Irish. That was it. Everyone had their own distinct culture, their own political traditions. But as the English nation steadily grew richer, building up its military muscle thanks to trade and early industrialization, it realized it had the leverage to start dominating its neighbors. Section 4. The subjugation of Scotland. So, step 1 of this expansion. The major political milestone here is the Act of Union in 1707. Technically, this legally formed the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Sounds like a totally equal partnership, right? Well, actually scratch that. In reality, it just meant England was legally able to force its will on Scotland. The new British Parliament was immediately packed with English members. And the result? Scotland's unique culture was systematically crushed. The Catholic clans living up in the Scottish Highlands faced brutal, terrible repression. I mean, they were strictly forbidden from speaking their native Gaelic language or wearing their traditional national dress. And tragically, thousands were just forcibly driven right out of their homelands. It was essentially unity achieved by erasing a culture. Section 5. The incorporation of Ireland. All right, let's look across the Irish Sea for the next phase of this long drawn-out process. The incredibly messy and contentious incorporation of Ireland. Now, Ireland was a deeply, deeply divided country, specifically between Catholics and Protestants. And the English Parliament, they saw this religious fracture and completely exploited it. They actively backed the Protestant minority, giving them the money and power to cement their dominance over a country that was overwhelmingly Catholic. And anytime the Catholics tried to push back or revolt against this British dominance, the English military stepped in and crushed it. The tension in Ireland finally reached a boiling point at the end of the 18th century. In 1798, a guy named Wolfe Tone led a massive rebellion with his organization, the United Irishmen. But it failed. And the fallout from that failed revolt gave the English Parliament exactly the pretext they were waiting for. Just a few years later, in 1801, Ireland was forcibly and officially absorbed into the United Kingdom. Section 6. Forging a British Identity. Okay, so now you've got this new United Kingdom, but you forced all these distinct, often very resentful ethnic groups together. How do you actually make them feel like one unified nation? Well, you have to invent a brand new British identity. To do this, they aggressively pushed the idea of a grand, glorious global empire. Look at this visual. You see Britannia, this female personification of the nation, literally sitting triumphantly on top of the globe. They wanted people to forget their local roots and instead feel this new shared pride in British imperialism. Basically, hey, you can't be proudly Scottish or proudly Irish anymore, but look, you get to be part of the most powerful empire in the world. But abstract ideas aren't really enough, are they? They needed everyday, tangible, cultural symbols to enforce this new identity. So, the state actively forged this new British nation by promoting a dominant English culture. They rolled out the British flag, the Union Jack. They made everyone sing the new national anthem, God Save Our Noble King. And, most crucially, they enforced the English language. By making these specific English symbols the official law of the land, the older nations like Scotland, Ireland, and Wales officially survived only as subordinate partners in their own homes. And that wraps up our deep dive into Chapter 1 for today. We started by asking how Britain dodged the massive, explosive revolutions of mainland Europe, and we found our answer in this slow, calculated, long-drawn-out process driven by Parliament. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to really chew on for your exams. History books love to paint Britain's path as more stable, maybe even more peaceful than the bloody revolutions in France. But when you look at the suppression of the Gaelic language, the forced evictions in the Highlands, and the religious manipulation in Ireland, is a centuries-long process of systematic cultural erasure really less violent than a sudden revolution? It definitely makes you rethink the true human cost of a quote-unquote bloodless unification, doesn't it? Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer today, guys. Keep studying hard, keep asking those big questions, and I will see you in our next lesson.